30 seconds. That is the window a British liaison officer had between the moment a U.S. Army sergeant raised his weapon at an Afghan National Army commander and the moment that incident became an international diplomatic incident logged at CENTCOM, escalated to the Pentagon, and forwarded to two governments whose relationship was already hanging by a fraying thread in the summer of 2007. 30 seconds to get between two men who both believed they were right. 30 seconds to stop something that could not be undone once it started. He did not shout. He did not reach for his own weapon. He walked into the space between them and said 7 words in a voice that carried the particular calm of a man who has already decided what he is willing to risk to keep a situation from detonating. The words were simple. He had already spoken to the commander. He had not yet. But in the arithmetic of crisis management at a forward operating base in Helmand Province, the lie that prevented a confrontation was worth more than the truth that caused one. By the time anyone compared notes, the temperature had dropped enough to work with. The Afghan commander had been acknowledged. The American sergeant had been given a ladder to climb down from. And the incident that would have required a board of inquiry, a formal protest through the British embassy in Kabul, and a press release carefully worded to avoid mentioning what had actually happened in that compound courtyard, was instead handled, filed, and quietly closed before it reached anyone above the rank of major. What that British officer represented in that moment was not an accident of geography or a happy coincidence of good timing. He was the product of a system that Britain had built, refined, and deployed specifically because someone in Whitehall understood that in a coalition war fought inside a culture neither ally fully understood, the man who could walk between them and speak to both was worth more than a company of riflemen. His title was liaison officer. His role was officially described as enabling command and control between coalition partners and Afghan National Army units. What he actually did every single day in a language that was partly military doctrine and partly human instinct was keep a coalition together at the seams. To understand how a single British officer could stand between a U.S. sergeant and an Afghan Kandak commander and defuse an incident before the Pentagon had time to hear about it, you have to understand what Helmand Province looked like in 2006 and 2007, and why the coalition that arrived there was, beneath its shared uniforms and shared enemy, not a single organism, but a collection of different countries with different institutional histories, different doctrines, different cultural tolerances, and different ideas about what winning in Afghanistan actually meant. Britain had fought in Afghanistan before, not metaphorically, not in the institutional memory of staff college case studies, but physically, in the same ground, against the same tribes, over the same passes and compounds and river valleys that British soldiers were now walking into again. The First Anglo-Afghan War ended in 1842 with the near-total annihilation of a British force retreating from Kabul through the Khyber Pass, a catastrophe in which roughly 16,000 British and Indian troops and camp followers died or were killed. The second ended in 1880 with the Battle of Maiwand, fought near Kandahar, in which a British brigade was shattered by Afghan forces and became one of the most studied British military defeats of the 19th century. The Third Anglo-Afghan War ended in 1919, with Afghanistan gaining full independence from British influence over its foreign policy. 3 wars. 3 lessons about the impossibility of imposing order on a landscape and a people that had been resisting external authority for 2,000 years. When British forces deployed to Helmand Province in the spring of 2006 as part of the International Security Assistance Force's expansion into southern Afghanistan, the institutional memory of those previous conflicts was present, at least among those who had bothered to read the history. Helmand specifically was known territory in the deepest sense. The province was referenced in military histories going back to the 19th century. Its tribal geography, the Alizai, the Ishaqzai, the Nurzai, the Barakzai, and a dozen other Pashtun lineages, each with their own grievances, alliances, and calculations about which foreign force was worth supporting and which was worth outlasting, had been mapped and analyzed and ignored with serial consistency by every outside force that had ever come through. The British arrived in 2006 expecting a reconstruction mission. They had been told at the level of ministers and senior generals that they might deploy to Helmand and fire not a shot in anger. That assessment was based on inadequate intelligence, optimistic assumptions, and a misreading of the degree to which the Taliban had reconstituted itself since being driven from power in 2001. Within weeks of the initial deployment, British soldiers from 3 Para and the units attached to 16 Air Assault Brigade were fighting some of the most intense combat British troops had experienced since the Korean War. General David Richards, commanding ISAF at the time, described the fighting in Helmand in those terms explicitly. The province was not just a combat zone. It was the world's largest producer of opium poppy, accounting for somewhere between 80% and 90% of the global heroin supply during the mid-2000s. The economy of Helmand was built on poppy. The tribal power structures were financed in part through poppy. The Taliban's resurgence was funded in part through poppy. And the British had arrived partly because the UK was the lead nation on counter-narcotics within the coalition, and Helmand was the narcotics heartland. The combination of military intervention and counter-narcotics mandate was, from the perspective of local farmers and power brokers, not a liberation force, but an economic threat. Word of the British arrival and its purpose had spread before the first boot hit the ground at Lashkar Gah, and the Taliban had used that word to recruit. Into this environment arrived not just British soldiers, but a coalition structure of considerable complexity. ISAF, by 2006, was a NATO-led mission with troops from dozens of contributing nations, each operating under national caveats that restricted what they could and could not do, where they could and could not go, and under what circumstances they were permitted to engage in combat. The American military operated under 2 separate command structures simultaneously. There was ISAF, the NATO mission, and there was Operation Enduring Freedom, the strictly U.S.-led counterterrorism operation that ran in parallel, answering directly to the U.S. Department of Defense rather than to NATO headquarters. In practice, this meant that American Special Operations Forces conducting night raids against high-value targets in Helmand were operating under a chain of command entirely separate from the British task force Helmand headquarters at Lashkar Gah, and coordination between the two was an ongoing negotiation rather than a guaranteed function. The British managed their sector through a structure called the Operational Mentoring and Liaison Team, or OMLT, pronounced informally as omelette, a nickname that conveyed the dark humor of men asked to perform an extraordinarily complex function in extraordinarily dangerous conditions. An OMLT was a small unit of British soldiers embedded directly within an Afghan National Army Kandak, the Afghan equivalent of a battalion, numbering roughly 600 men. Each Kandak OMLT was composed of between 13 and 20 British personnel, typically drawn from an infantry battalion or artillery regiment who lived with the Afghans, patrolled with the Afghans, and in the most intense periods of the Helmand campaign, fought alongside the Afghans inside the district centers and forward operating bases that British forces had occupied across the province. By 2007, the UK was providing 5 OMLTs to the 3rd Brigade of the 205th Corps of the Afghan National Army, 1 for each Kandak, including 3 infantry units, a combat support Kandak, and a combat service support Kandak, with a combined OMLT strength of around 250 British personnel embedded across the Afghan force. The role of an OMLT officer was, on paper, clearly defined. He coached, trained, mentored, and provided liaison between his Afghan counterparts and the wider coalition. He called in close air support, coordinated casualty evacuation, and ensured that the ANA unit he was attached to received the enabling support it needed to operate. In practice, the role required something that no field manual had ever adequately captured, which was the daily exercise of cultural translation across 3 simultaneous languages: English military doctrine, Pashto and Dari social custom, and the universal human dialect of honor and face. The Pashtun concept of honor, encapsulated in the tribal code known as Pashtunwali, was not an abstract cultural curiosity. It was the operating system of human relationships in Helmand Province. Pashtunwali governed everything from hospitality to revenge to the management of armed confrontation between men. Under its codes, an insult to a man's dignity required a response commensurate with the insult. Failing to respond was not merely embarrassing, it was socially catastrophic, marking the man as someone who could not defend his own honor, whose word carried no weight, whose authority over others was forfeit. An Afghan Kandak commander who was publicly humiliated by a coalition soldier, regardless of the language or the circumstances, was not simply offended. He was structurally damaged. His ability to command his own men depended on those men believing he commanded respect. If they watched a foreign soldier disrespect him and he did not respond, they would draw conclusions about what kind of man led them. The Americans who arrived in Helmand, first in smaller special operations teams, and then in larger conventional formations as the surge of 2009 began, were operating from a military culture with its own deeply held convictions about authority, speed of action, force protection, and the primacy of mission accomplishment. American military doctrine in Afghanistan during this period, particularly in the years before the McChrystal-era counterinsurgency reforms of 2009 took hold, tended to prioritize kinetic action, the direct engagement and destruction of enemy forces, over the patient relationship building that British officers with a Northern Ireland or colonial-era counterinsurgency background recognized as the slower but more durable path to stability. This was not ignorance. American soldiers were not less intelligent or less brave than their British counterparts. They were operating from different institutional histories and different strategic assumptions about what worked. The friction between these two approaches was real, documented, and occasionally severe. The most visible strategic-level manifestation of this friction came in September 2006, when British Brigadier Ed Butler, commanding Task Force Helmand, made the decision to negotiate a withdrawal from the besieged district center of Musa Qala under the terms of a local agreement brokered with Helmand tribal elders. The Musa Qala Accord, as it became known, allowed British forces and their Afghan government partners to leave the district center in exchange for a commitment from local elders to keep Taliban forces out of the town. Butler and General Richards, then ISAF commander, saw it as exactly the kind of locally negotiated Afghan solution that could provide stability without endless kinetic engagement. The Americans saw it very differently. American officials believed the Taliban would exploit the withdrawal and favored a more aggressive stance. The British presented the deal as a model of an Afghan solution, and U.S. criticism of the accord drove relations between the two allies to what one account described as an all-time low. The Elders' Agreement eventually did unravel, and in February 2007, Taliban forces under Mullah Abdul Ghaffur stormed back into Musa Qala, executed the elder who had brokered the truce, and reimposed Taliban control. The town was not retaken until December 2007 in a major joint operation. The Americans felt vindicated. The British argued the accord had bought time and that its failure had as much to do with wider political dynamics as with the agreement itself. Neither side was entirely wrong. Both sides were certain they were right. It was in this environment, at the tactical level, hundreds of kilometers and several command layers below, where generals argued about strategic approach, that the liaison officer's true function became indispensable. Because the strategic friction between Britain and the United States manifested itself daily in ways that never appeared in any after-action report or diplomatic cable, in the moment-by-moment navigation of joint operations, shared compounds, shared checkpoints, and shared patrol routes where soldiers from two different armies, operating from two different cultural frameworks, had to cooperate under extreme pressure and occasionally with their lives at immediate stake. The specific category of incident that the British liaison officer was uniquely positioned to prevent was this: an American soldier operating from a genuine and legitimate concern about force protection, security protocol, or mission accomplishment would interact with an Afghan National Army officer, or NCO, in a manner that was, by any reading of Pashtunwali, a serious and public affront. The American soldier was not trying to insult anyone. He was trying to get something done. He was operating in a hot compound at the end of a long patrol, dealing with an ANA counterpart whose level of English was limited, whose unit's discipline did not match American standards, and whose apparent reluctance to follow orders seemed to the American soldier to be obstruction or incompetence. The Afghan officer, meanwhile, was operating in his own country under a code of honor that had been in place for centuries and was being treated by a foreign soldier as if his authority over his own men was contingent on that foreign soldier's approval. The misalignment between these two positions was not theoretical. It happened constantly. And every time it happened without a mediating presence capable of addressing both sides simultaneously, it generated consequences ranging from the merely damaging to the potentially catastrophic. British OMLT officers were trained to see this dynamic and to intervene at exactly the moment when intervention could still resolve rather than inflame. The training came from multiple sources: the British Army's institutional experience in Northern Ireland, where soldiers had spent 30 years operating among a civilian population deeply hostile to their presence and learning to manage confrontation through restraint rather than force escalation, had produced a generation of officers who understood the value of not being the person who made a bad situation worse. The Army's history in colonial counterinsurgency, from Malaya to Borneo to Oman, had embedded a set of doctrinal assumptions about the importance of local relationships, local knowledge, and local legitimacy that American military culture, for understandable reasons, rooted in its own very different institutional history, had not developed to the same degree. The OMLT officer's day-to-day existence in Helmand was physically and psychologically demanding to a degree that is difficult to overstate. He lived with his Afghan Kandak rather than in a separate British base. This meant sharing the same rations, the same sleeping arrangements, the same vulnerabilities, and the same intelligence picture, which was often fragmentary, often wrong, and always incomplete. He woke in the same compound, walked to the same briefing, and went on patrol with the same men he was simultaneously trying to train, advise, and represent to a coalition command structure that sometimes had very different ideas about what the ANA was capable of and how it should be employed. He was responsible not just for mentoring his Afghan counterparts, but for maintaining the relationship between them and the coalition forces they operated alongside, which in Helmand by 2007 increasingly meant American units arriving with their own ideas about how operations should be planned and conducted. Captain Sean Dolan of the 1st Battalion, the Worcestershire and Sherwood Foresters Regiment, was 40 years old when he was killed by Taliban mortar fire in Helmand Province on the 30th of June, 2007. He had been acting precisely in the liaison role described here, embedded between his own battalion and a joint U.S. task force and Afghan National Army operation when the first mortar round came in. It fatally wounded him and seriously injured an American soldier beside him. He was one of dozens of British officers who served and in some cases died in the space between coalition partners and Afghan forces, doing work that the public would never fully see and that the official record would never fully capture. His death illustrated in the starkest possible terms what it meant to be the link between forces that needed each other and frequently did not understand each other. The linkage problem ran in both directions. British OMLT officers had to manage not only American behavior toward their Afghan counterparts, but also ANA behavior toward American forces. Afghan soldiers and officers had their own grievances about the coalition, their own frustrations with foreign troops, who they sometimes felt treated them as auxiliary support rather than equal partners. Their own cultural responses to perceived slights that did not express themselves as diplomatic protests, but as sudden, unpredictable confrontations in compound courtyards and at vehicle checkpoints. An Afghan Kandak commander who felt his professional judgment had been consistently overridden by coalition officers, whose operations had been planned by foreigners who had asked for his opinion as a formality but acted on their own assessment regardless, and who had watched his men being bypassed and marginalized in their own country, was not a passive party to be managed. He was a man with weapons and followers and a code of honor that had its own internal logic and its own consequences. The British OMLT officer in the middle of this understood both sides, not because he was uniquely intelligent or uniquely empathetic, but because the institutional framework that had sent him there had insisted, more consistently than most coalition militaries, that understanding the local side of the relationship was not optional. The British Army's pre-deployment training for Helmand included elements of Pashto language instruction, Afghan cultural awareness, and specific coaching on the dynamics of Pashtunwali and its implications for face-to-face interactions in a high-stakes environment. It was not perfect preparation, and many officers arrived with gaps that could only be filled by time on the ground. But it was more preparation than many American units received, and the difference manifested itself in exactly the kind of incident that could be resolved in 30 seconds by someone who knew what was actually happening, or escalate in 30 seconds into something that could not be undone by someone who did not. The Musa Qala strategic dispute and the tactical compound courtyard confrontation were, structurally, the same problem at different scales. In both cases, two forces with the same nominal enemy and the same nominal objective were operating from incompatible assumptions about how the mission should be conducted, what respect for local actors required, and whose judgment should take precedence when the two came into conflict. At the strategic level, generals resolved those conflicts through formal channels, liaison officers at headquarters level, escalating chains of command, diplomatic back channels between Whitehall and the Pentagon, and the careful management of national prestige in meetings that were conducted in English, but were about something older and more fundamental than language. At the tactical level, where none of those mechanisms were available and the situation was developing faster than any of them could respond, the single British officer who happened to be in the right compound at the right moment with the right combination of knowledge and nerve was the entire mechanism. 3 British soldiers from the Royal Anglian Regiment were killed on the 23rd of August, 2007, when a US F-15 fighter struck them by mistake during a combat engagement in Helmand. 2 Danish soldiers were killed on the 26th of September, 2007, by a British missile in a separate friendly fire incident. These were not liaison failures in the sense of officers who failed to do their jobs. They were the tragic consequences of the same fog of war that had always produced accidental deaths in coalition operations, amplified by the pace and intensity of the Helmand campaign and the complexity of a command structure in which multiple national chains of command intersected imperfectly. But they illustrated the cost of the gap between forces who needed to be aligned and were not. Every incident of genuine interoperability failure, whether it ended in tragedy or was resolved before it reached that point, reinforced the value of the officer who stood in the gap. The broader context of the American military's cultural approach in Afghanistan is important to understand clearly and without caricature. American forces in Helmand did adapt. The arrival of General Stanley McChrystal as commander of coalition forces in 2009 brought a strategic revolution in how the mission was conceptualized, with counterinsurgency doctrine placing population protection at the center and restricting the use of firepower in ways that many American officers found genuinely painful but accepted as necessary. The surge of 2009 and 2010, which poured tens of thousands of additional troops into Afghanistan, including 11,000 Marines into Helmand alone, was accompanied by a doctrinal reset that brought American ground-level practice much closer to what British officers embedded in OMLTs had been doing for 3 years in smaller numbers and with far less support. The Americans learned, as they always do eventually, and learned fast. But the period between 2006 and 2009 in Helmand was characterized by genuine doctrinal friction that manifested at every level of the coalition, from the strategic disagreement over the Musa Qala Accord to the daily negotiation of joint patrols and shared compounds. The British officer who had already spoken to the commander was doing something that has no adequate name in military doctrine. It is sometimes called liaison. It is sometimes called conflict resolution. In political science, it might be called mediation. None of those words fully captures what was actually happening, which was the real-time management of 3 simultaneous relationships. His relationship with the American sergeant, built on coalition solidarity and the shared language of professional soldiers. His relationship with the Afghan commander, built on months of daily presence, shared meals, and the slow accumulation of trust that is the only currency that operates across a cultural gap that wide. And his relationship with the situation itself, which he understood in a way that neither the American nor the Afghan fully did, because he was the only person present who could read both men's positions and see the gap between them clearly enough to build a bridge across it in 30 seconds. The lie that he had already spoken to the commander was not a deception in any moral sense. It was a structural intervention, a way of buying time for the truth to catch up with the emergency. Within the hour, he had spoken to the Afghan commander, listened to the grievance in full, acknowledged it, and found a path through it that preserved the dignity both men needed. He had spoken to the American sergeant separately, explained what had been read into the interaction and why, and done it in a way that informed rather than accused. He had closed the gap. He had written no report. He had filed no complaint. He had made one phone call to the officer above him that had consisted of 3 sentences. There had been an incident. It had been resolved. No further action was required. The word that mattered in that 3-sentence summary was the last one: required. Not recommended, not advised, not suggested. Required. The choice of that word was itself a piece of liaison work. It told his superior officer that the situation was handled in the only way that preserved the operational relationship, and that reopening it through formal channels would do more damage than the original incident. It was a judgment call made by a captain or major in a compound in Helmand Province at the intersection of 2 military cultures that had been straining against each other for 3 years, in the heat and the dust and the daily negotiation of a shared war. The OMLT program as a whole, across its full run from 2006 to the transition to brigade advisory groups, produced hundreds of officers and soldiers who developed this capacity. Some of them wrote about it afterwards in military journals and academic papers and memoirs that circulated mainly within defense circles. Lieutenant Mike Martin, writing in the British Army Review in 2009, outlined the importance of cultural understanding to military operations in exactly the terms that OMLT experience had taught. The academic literature on the OMLT program, including a comprehensive study by Leiden University that reconstructed the evolution of British mentoring efforts from Herrick 4 through Herrick 11, documented the transformation of an ad hoc capability improvised under fire into a professionalized, doctrinalized function with pre-deployment training pipelines, dedicated equipment, and a growing body of institutional knowledge about what worked and what did not. The study documented that the OMLTs lived, trained, and fought with the Afghan National Army, sharing the same dangers and teaching by example. That proximity was not comfortable. It was operationally essential. By the time the British combat mission formally ended with the handover of Camp Bastion to Afghan forces on the 26th of October, 2014, more than 150,000 British service personnel had served in Afghanistan. 454 of them had been killed, a number that exceeded the British death toll in the Falklands War of 1982. 2,000 more were wounded. The Helmand campaign had consumed 13 years of continuous British military effort, and the verdict on what it achieved strategically remains genuinely contested among historians, generals, and politicians who participated in it. What is less contested is the quality of the individual work done at the level of the OMLT officer in the compound, and the captain on the phone telling his superior that no further action was required. The value of the liaison officer in a coalition war is not visible in the operations that succeeded. It is visible in the incidents that never happened, in the confrontations that never became firefights. In the grievances that were addressed before, they became grudges that turned into non-cooperation, that turned into intelligence not shared, and warnings not passed, and patrols not supported at the critical moment. Every one of those non-events represents a decision made by a single individual who understood both sides of a gap and chose to stand in it. They are the negative space of the historical record. You cannot count them. You cannot name them in the way you name battles. But they were as real as anything else that happened in Helmand between 2006 and 2014, and they shaped the operational environment in ways that no satellite, no drone, no intelligence fusion cell, and no additional battalion of soldiers could have replicated. The 30 seconds in that compound courtyard were not exceptional. They were routine. They happened in some form or another on every day that British liaison officers were embedded with Afghan forces alongside American units, which was every day of the campaign. What made the 30 seconds significant was not the drama of the moment, which was real enough, but the infrastructure of knowledge and trust and institutional investment that made them possible. Years of pre-deployment training, months of shared meals and shared patrols and shared near-misses that built the relationship that made the Afghan commander willing to accept the British officer's word as a bridge over the gap. A military culture that had insisted, through decades of counterinsurgency operations in places where the British Army had not always been welcome. That understanding the local side was not a luxury, but a prerequisite for operating at all. The officer who said he had already spoken to the commander was drawing on all of that. He was drawing on Northern Ireland and Malaya and Oman and 3 previous Anglo-Afghan wars and the institutional stubbornness of a military that had learned, at considerable cost, that the man who can walk between 2 forces and be trusted by both is worth more than his rank suggests. He was drawing on the specific lesson of Helmand, which was that in a war fought among a population whose cultural framework was not optional background knowledge, but the actual operating environment, the soldier who understood that framework and could navigate it was the coalition's most valuable asset in the moments that mattered most. He walked into the space between them. He said 7 words. He had already spoken to the commander. The incident did not happen. The Pentagon did not hear about it. The mission continued. And somewhere in the operational record of Task Force Helmand for that day in 2007, there is an entry that records nothing of significance because the man who could see the significance had already resolved it and filed no report and made 1 3-sentence phone call and then gone back to his work. That is what it meant to be the liaison officer, not the man who fought the war. The man who kept it from becoming a different, worse war than the one it already was. In 30 seconds, with 7 words, before the Pentagon heard a thing.